Hello, my name is Bruce Purdue. I'm with the Alabama Technology Network. Today we're going to talk about Form R, an EPA document, find out who is subject and what to expect when you start filling out one of these forms. This presentation is designed for facilities who are unsure about whether they are subject to the reporting requirements, or for reporters who would like a brief overview of the requirements. Form R came to us from a law passed by Congress in 1986 called the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, otherwise known as SARA. SARA has many sections with many different requirements. Today, however, we are only focusing on the Form R reporting requirements found in Title III of SARA. Title III of SARA is formally known as EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. The law gives American citizens the right to know what toxic chemicals are being released by industries that could affect them, the citizen, the family, or their home. The Toxic Release Inventory, or TRI, is a tool that citizens can access on the EPA website to find that information. The Form R that industries submit to the EPA provides the data for the TRI database. To this end, industries must submit to the EPA amounts of certain chemicals that they are releasing to the environment via air, water, and land. The first question is, does my facility fall within a range of SIC codes? Most manufacturers do. If the answer to that question is true, the next question is, does my facility employ more than 10 full-time employees? If the answer to that question is true, then we ask if we exceed the thresholds that make us subject to this reporting requirement. Do we manufacture, process, or otherwise use chemicals on the 313 list over certain thresholds? Each one of these categories has its own threshold, and we'll get to that in a minute. But for the moment, let's define each of these categories. The first category is manufacture. This is probably the most straightforward category. Do you make the listed material? And by make, that doesn't just include end products. If you have an intermediate stream where a material gets created, but then it's reabsorbed in a later process, you still have to count that intermediate stream as being manufactured. The same thing is true of byproducts and impurities. Process is one of the trickier determinations. It includes something as simple as repackaging material from bulk storage into packaging for commercial distribution. It is processing if you use a material as a reactant to make a different product. If you add a material to a final product, it also counts as processing. For example, the solvents in paint, such as toluene or xylene, would be processed because it is added as an article component. The otherwise use category is kind of a catch-all. The most common otherwise use categories include solvents, lubricants, refrigerants, and waste remediation chemicals. So, what are the thresholds? The thresholds are 25,000 pounds per year if you manufacture it, 25,000 pounds per year if you process it, and 10,000 pounds per year if you otherwise use it. Now, please note, for all three of these categories, it's not how much you store, it's how much you use. And for most manufacturing processes, these are pretty low thresholds. If you are subject to the Form R reporting requirements, you may need to know there are some specific things that need to be looked at. Thresholds for some chemicals are calculated differently. PBTs, or persistent bioaccumulative toxins, may have much lower thresholds, 100 pounds or even 10 pounds. Some materials are calculated as groups of chemicals. For example, some metals like lead, arsenic, nickel, or zinc are considered parts of compounds, not as individual chemicals. So if you manufactured 18,000 pounds of lead oxide and 10,000 pounds of lead carbonate, then you would exceed the 25,000 pound category for lead compounds. However, some categories are considered only if they are in a specific form. For example, hydrochloric acid is considered only in its aqueous form. Zinc is considered only if it is in a dust or fume form. There are two major steps for Form R submittals. The first is to determine whether your facility exceeds any of the thresholds we've just discussed. Your facility may only have one chemical to report, or it may have dozens. Anyway, you must submit a Form R for each chemical that exceeds that threshold. If your facility exceeds a threshold for even one chemical, it must submit a Form R before July the 1st for the previous reporting year. Once you've determined that you are subject to the reporting requirements, you have to determine how much of each chemical you've released to each of the three environmental media: air, water, and land. Air can include both stack emissions as well as fugitive emissions. Water includes both direct discharges and discharges to publicly owned treatment works. And land is typically based on how much of the waste you send to a landfill. For air emissions, the best source of data is from stack tests. However, even stack tests may not give data on specific emissions. Some stack tests, for example, may only look at VOC emissions. If that's the case, then you'd need to use engineering judgment to determine what percentage of your VOC emissions were made up by a listed chemical. Similar approaches can be used by employing emission factors or total materials used or mass balance. Water discharge emissions are calculated similarly, either using samples that have been analyzed for the listed chemicals or using engineering knowledge. Land emissions, that is, material sent to landfills, have a couple of different forms. Profiled waste sent to hazardous waste landfills may have data readily available. However, unprofiled waste requires calculations. If you know the percentage makeup, or the parts per million, just apply that proportion to the total number of pounds delivered to the landfill, and you can use your uniform hazardous waste manifests to totalize the number of pounds shipped to a landfill in any given year. Now, if you're shipping a waste for which you have no analysis, then you have to use mass balance. To do this, take all of the pounds of the material that you use or purchase over the year and determine what percentage of the listed component is in your raw material, and assume that your non-analyzed waste has the same percentage. Here's an example. If your facility uses 4.5 million pounds of paint, and the paint has 18,500 pounds of toluene, and toluene is a listed chemical, then divide the two, and you'll find that your raw material is 2.63% toluene. From this point, we must make the assumption that the waste also contains 2.63% toluene. Now, if you ship 15,000 pounds of waste to a landfill, 2.63% of that 15,000 pounds is 394.5 pounds of the listed toluene that ends up in the landfill. Please note that if you ship waste to multiple landfills, then you must report the proportion of the quantities shipped to each landfill. To summarize, the deadline is July the 1st for the previous reporting year. You should have the previous year's data available anytime after January 1st, so get started as soon as you can. The data must be entered electronically at EPA's portal found at cdx.epa.gov.